Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Michael Baker toko ingoa. I'm very pleased to be contributing to this course today on countering disinformation in the age of COVID-19, and I'm going to be talking about some insights from the pandemic response. I'm very sorry I can't be with you today in person. So I'm going to go through a few key aspects of this subject. So firstly, looking at some of the key features of pandemics in public health that affect how we talk about it, clarifying some of the public health goals, identifying public health information and misinformation, communication opportunities, effective science communication, and then some of the conclusions and lessons we can learn from this current pandemic. So just looking at pandemics, they have a number of distinctive features that we see over and over again. They can have a high impact, although this obviously varies. They promote or increase inequalities. They behave in uncertain ways. They are often controllable, almost always, and as we've discovered in New Zealand with our successful elimination strategy, and they frequently cause panic and outrage. And one thing, of course, we're seeing with COVID-19, which is unusual for a respiratory pandemic, is it's very prolonged. It's continued now for more than a year from its first origins, and we're almost certainly going to see effects of this pandemic for several years ahead. Another key factor we have to think about with communication around the pandemic is the public health context. And one thing about public health, although it's like other branches of medicine, it is concerned with preventing disease and prolonging life and promoting health. A distinct feature is this huge need for the organized efforts of society. And that means there's a huge requirement for effective communication, particularly for those of us working in the public health field. So there are some real challenges with public health. One is that, of course, it's a public good. It's not, therefore, not supplied sufficiently by the market. And that means that you need ongoing government investment. So that requires advocacy. There's also the prevention paradox. And so the people who are saved from illness and long-term disabilities are not visible because they don't exist because of prevention, whereas the costs and adverse effects of interventions are conspicuous. So again, another factor that means is underinvestment in public health. There's also short-termism, because a lot of public health benefits occur in the future, and so they may be undervalued compared with immediate curative services. And another problem, I think, for public health is commercial determinants of health. And these are often quite powerful interests that may resist regulation of unhealthy products and services, but also of pandemic control measures. And we've seen this play out around the globe where basically highly effective public health measures have been wound down on the basis that they might be interfering with the function of the economy and the business sector. So this is one of those familiar concepts, a public health triumph. Nothing happened. But how will we know if our pandemic guidelines work? Asked Piglet. The world will think we overreacted, said Pooh. And this is one of those truisms of a successful pandemic response. Just reflecting on my own experience, which I'm going to bring to this discussion, I would say that parts of 2020 were the most intense periods of my working life. And some of this actually was around media engagement. And this was looking at the first 6 months of the year. The Science Media Centre tracks the work of, I think, about 70 of the media commentators. And they said that, yes, I'm I'm forming this base strata here during that 6-month period, and contributed over 25% of the identified media mentions over that period. So it was intensely busy, particularly at certain peaks. So looking at, I think, one of the most important strategic issues around public health communication is this great need to think about goals. And for many of us in public health, that actually comes quite naturally. After a few years, we do think of those terms. And this is the idea that the drivers for science communication are thinking about strategy, analysis, and research that can identify these key goals. And also, I think our values and ethics also feed into that. And then we have these communication objectives and main messages that will be quite specific to certain areas we're working in. So these key main messages. And then we move on to the outputs. So we do need communication opportunities, and these can be strategic or opportunistic, provided by various media. And generally, our intermediate outcomes for all our target audiences are around improving their awareness of key issues, and also giving them evidence about certain the consequences of certain actions or inactions. We also have here thinking about the outcomes and impacts. Sometimes it's just about policy change. Sometimes it's about changing people's behavior, generally to reduce risk. And there's also a more general goal, which is around science literacy, interest, and trust that builds resilience and capacity. So from my own experience, here's some examples of the need to clarify public health goals. So this is looking at some of the key objectives. And initially, with my colleagues, we were focusing really on encouraging a proactive response to the emerging pandemic in the first part of last year, then encouraging adoption of an elimination strategy in March and April, and then one specific area, building the case for mass masking as a key control measure, and encouraging a shift from a reactive to a more strategic approach to the pandemic from September onwards. And then throughout this whole period, promoting public awareness and countering disinformation. So here's an example that was quite a good test case for a group of us, and this was around mask use. And this showed that, or our reading of the evidence was that traditional hygiene measures were fine. I mean, stay at home if sick is very important, wash your hands. Respiratory hygiene has some role. But the problem is with COVID-19 is that asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic sources are very important. Also, the peak of infectivity occurs before people are symptomatic. So these people won't be staying at home, and they won't have symptoms, so they won't be practicing respiratory hygiene. So this is where respiratory droplets and aerosols, this is a second scientific feature, are the dominant mode of transmission. So putting all this together, the only measure that will actually reduce transmission in this setting, I mean, assuming that you've got a degree of physical distancing and other measures, but if you're looking at respiratory hygiene measures, you're looking at masks, and this is mass masking for source control and some personal protection. So we felt that the science evidence was very strong that mass masking had a role, and this was again a communication objective that we had. I should say, for my efforts, I'm now immortalized on one brand of mask that's sold through Te Papa. Along the way, like probably many of you, there were examples of misinformation, even disinformation. And some of these were really ideologically driven. We had at a global level the Great Barrington Declaration, which was some quite well-established scientists coming to the conclusion that the pandemic was hugely overstated, and really promoting these ideas widely in the United States. And we had their small equivalent in New Zealand, the Plan B group, who have been really throughout the whole pandemic absolutely convinced that the risk has been hugely overstated, and some of you will be familiar with their views. Then we have obviously some media picking up on what I think is sometimes misinformation, and like Fox News is obviously one of those channels where I think they are very economical on evidence there. And we also had some political parties in New Zealand that were really, I think, promoting this alternative agenda, the plandemic and other slogans. And I think some of it did feed into their political base. But it was interesting, they had very little support in the election, less than 1%, which I think did confirm that New Zealanders are quite scientifically literate as a group. So at different points, it was useful, I thought, to identify some of the myths being promoted by these sources and look at the realities. And one, for example, is that COVID-19 is no worse than the flu, when clearly it is far more serious than seasonal flu. Obviously, it depends on the age structure of the population and certain details, but was still markedly higher fatality risk. And some of the other statements, learn to live with the virus, that's very difficult to do in practice. Herd immunity will not protect us. We do need herd immunity from vaccines. It's a vaccinology concept. It's a false dichotomy, choosing the health of people, the economy. They go together. We can't see ourselves off forever. We can, in fact, start to move towards quarantine-free travel, obviously very cautiously. Sweden did it better. No, they didn't. Taiwan did it better. So these are just examples. There are many more of where there's a view that's promoted by some groups where it's completely opposite from what the evidence is saying. So that is really misinformation. And sometimes we can counter that by referring to what the evidence is showing, but it's not a guaranteed approach for changing behavior. So when we think about communication opportunities, they do split into what you could call proactive or strategic opportunities, reactive or opportunistic opportunities. So some of the proactive approaches, obviously, for scientists and researchers, we do scientific papers and reports and blogs, press releases, media interviews, seminars like what we're doing at the moment, and social media to varying degrees. And so this can be quite well planned and based on key messages. But there's also the reactive responses, and these frequently arise from media requests, media commentary, and also responding to misinformation. So looking at some of these areas in more detail, some of this debate happens in scientific literature. This is an example where the Plan B group published an item in the British Medical Journal where there were two sides to the debate presented about the elimination debate. And one of the statements they made in there was that their assertion that the infection fatality risk for COVID-19 is similar to that for seasonal flu. So we wrote a letter to rapid response, and the BMJ will publish some of these rapid responses actually in their formal journal, which they did in this case. And we made the case that COVID-19 is far more dangerous than seasonal flu, and we presented evidence to back that up. So that's one form of countering disinformation or misinformation. So for my efforts, there was more discussion about Plan B. I'm now, again, a version of me appears in a cartoon talking about it just wouldn't be Christmas without fruitcakes. And that fruitcake here, in this instance, appears to be COVID Plan B academics. So that's, I didn't call them fruitcakes, but that is obviously how that cartoonist has interpreted the discussion. So here's another example of responding to misinformation. And again, this was where I was approached by an entertainment reporter, which is a bit unusual because I'm not normally in the entertainment section, I hope. But this was an example where that well-known international epidemiologist Naz, of Bachelor contestant fame, was talking about her experience with COVID-19, which is perfectly okay. But unfortunately, she then generalized to the fact that this therefore must be a mild illness for everyone, and the response was overstated. So I had a dilemma about whether to respond to this, and I did. I made statements about the fact that it's a fallacy to generalize from your own experience. So this will come up for some of you who are dealing with misinformation of how to do this and of whether to respond or not. And one of the problems, of course, is that you do risk winding up in the swamp of discussion where you start to give more credence to some of the statements by the mere repetition of them. So I think this is, again, a slightly problematic way of responding. It's not something I would do very often. Another approach which I think is quite constructive is fact-checking. And I am occasionally approached by a fact-checking service for Australasia, which is based in Australia, and it's funded by the Pointer Institute, which I hadn't heard of until I talked to them more, that gets money from Facebook. And it puts its comments on its website. This is one I contributed to, where they picked up that there was some misreading of guidance on PCR tests. And some of these are quite interesting and fun to respond to, but like everything, it does take time. Apparently, posts on Facebook and Instagram can be taken down or be marked if they're found to be misleading. Another approach, which again is not something I've used very often, this is a regulatory approach. The Advertising Standards Authority can have a role in basically applying the Advertising Standards Authority codes. They will consider complaints for any advertising, and they can have ads removed or modified. And based on really absurd statements in some of Billy Te Kahika's statements leading up to the election, I did submit a formal complaint, and so did some other people, and this was upheld. And it was quite interesting reading their ruling, and so that was good to know that they can actually look at such statements, and they're reasonably quick. I mean, this took about a week. I mean, there are so many media and communication opportunities. Some of them, I think, there are opportunities to be, I think, more creative. This is something we actually did more than 2 years before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, to really commemorate a century after the 1918 flu pandemic, and just to visualize what it looks like, what it would look like at the peak of this kind of pandemic, where we had 440 people dying in a single day. And to visualize this, I persuaded I went to my son's school, and they all the boys, took a bit of effort. They lay out in the paddock, and they were photographed from a drone just to give a sense of what this actually looks like. So when we move into the area of effective science communication, there's very good guidance from the Science Media Centre. And again, they provide things like, obviously, lots of training and quite stripped down media checklists. And there's a strong emphasis there on identifying, again, your communication objectives for each interview, and thinking about your target audience and your main messages. So this is a very detailed slide, but I was just trying to summarize some what you could call communication tips. And again, it just builds on what the Science Media Centre states, that I think you really want to keep identifying the action you want, the goals, and the target audience, the message, the media. Think about your timing and approach. Are you going to be proactive or wait to be reactive sometimes? Press release, I think, is very valuable for sharpening up your ideas if you haven't already written something. And then always clarifying the aspects of the key aspects of the interview before you go in. Find out what angle they've got, their questions, and are you the right person? I think at this point, print and electronic media are a bit different. I'm not really covering social media here, but print, you can distinguish the background chat from bits you want to be quoted on, and sometimes ring back, or sometimes you can even check very technical pieces as well. Some journalists like you to do that. Again, radio and TV, I find it's quite useful to write out my main lines, just type them out beforehand. It doesn't take very long, just so you're getting them quite short and punchy. And the interviews can be slightly different depending on pre-record versus live. I mean, with pre-record, you should, and I don't always do this myself, but try and just say the key messages you're comfortable with and just keep repeating them different ways, and trying not to resist going too far away from those key messages. If it's a live interview, it's a bit different. You have to just keep steering it in the direction you want it to go in. So one thing about the COVID-19 response that I'm trying to build in, and this obviously doesn't always apply, but I think other key messages, co-benefits, and that's the idea of a broad reset to increase our focus and ability to manage major global health threats. The fact that most New Zealanders want a green recovery, a more equitable society, and the fact that we need to invest in public health infrastructure. This must be one of the best opportunities we'll ever have to build up that thinking and hopefully capacity in this area. So just to summarize some of the things I've learned from our year of COVID is that it does create multiple communications challenges for public health to support an effective response. The approach we take in communication, I think, depends very much on whether we want policy change, behavioral change, or the more general aspects of promoting resilience, trust and social license. The main thing, I think, in all of the communication, the most important thing is just having high quality, proactive and reactive media communication. I think it's useful to identify misinformation, disinformation, and think about situations where it may sometimes require a specific response. A lot of the time, there are many barriers to actually really taking on some misinformation, and sometimes it's better to let it go because you may be just drawing attention to it. And there's just a sheer exhaustion factor, I think, will set in, particularly in social media, if you wanted to really try and set the record straight. I mean, it's just not possible, and it won't work frequently. And again, just emphasizing these opportunities to pursue other or state other long-term public health goals and infrastructure needs. So I just want to acknowledge my great colleagues at the University of Otago and other institutions who are supporting this work. Luke Pilkinton-Ching for all his help with the visual material, and finally use for the flag debate. Thanks very much.